The Symbolism of Freemasonry by Albert Mackey. Preface. Among the diverse modes of imparting instruction to the uninitiated, the Masonic student is primarily concerned with two, namely, instruction by means of legends and that through symbols. It is to these two avenues, almost exclusively, that he owes all he presently comprehends, and all he can ever comprehend, of the philosophical system promulgated within the institution. All of its mysteries and dogmas which comprise its philosophy are entrusted for transmission to the neophyte sometimes through one, sometimes through the other of these two instructional methods, and occasionally through a combination of both. The Freemason possesses no means of accessing the esoteric teachings of the order save through the medium of a legend or a symbol. A legend diverges from a historical narrative in merely one respect, that it lacks documentary evidence of its authenticity. It is the progeny solely of tradition. Its particulars may be factual in part or in their entirety. There may exist no internal evidence to the contrary, or there may be internal indications that they are entirely fallacious. However, neither the possibility of truth in the former instance, nor the certainty of falsehood in the latter, can remove the traditional narrative from the category of legends. It remains a legend simply because it rests upon no written foundation. It is strictly oral and therefore legendary. In profound historical inquiries, such as the establishment of empires, the discovery and settlement of nations, or the rise and fall of dynasties, ascertaining the veracity or falsity of a legendary narrative is of paramount importance, for the value of history is compromised by the imputation of doubt. Yet, such is not the case within Freemasonry. Herein, there need be no absolute interrogation regarding the truth or falsity of the legend. The objective of Masonic legends is not to establish historical facts, but rather to convey philosophical doctrines. They serve as a method by which esoteric instruction is communicated, and the student accepts them with regard to nothing else save their positive utility and significance in developing Masonic dogmas. Consider, for instance, the Hiramic legend of the third degree. Of what consequence is it to the disciple of Masonry whether it be factual or fictitious? All that he seeks to ascertain is its internal signification, and upon learning that it is intended to illustrate the doctrine of the soul's immortality, he remains content with that interpretation, and he does not deem it necessary, except as a matter of curious or antiquarian inquiry, to investigate its historical accuracy or to reconcile any of its apparent contradictions. Thus it is with the lost keystone, thus with the second temple, thus with the hidden ark. To him, these represent legendary narratives which, much like a casket, would be devoid of value were it not for the precious jewel concealed within. Each of these legends constitutes the expression of a philosophical concept. But there exists another method of Masonic instruction, and that is through symbols. No science boasts greater antiquity than that of symbolism. During a bygone era, virtually all the erudition of the world was conveyed through symbols. And although modern philosophy presently concerns itself exclusively with abstract propositions, Freemasonry continues to cleave to the ancient method, and has preserved it in its primitive importance as a vehicle for communicating knowledge. In accordance with the derivation of the word from the Greek, to symbolize signifies to compare one entity with another. Consequently, a symbol is the expression of an idea derived from the comparison or contrast of a given object with a moral conception or attribute. Thus, we state that the plum is a symbol of rectitude in conduct. The physical attributes of the plum are herein compared or contrasted with the moral conception of virtue, or rectitude. Thereafter, to the speculative Mason, once he has been instructed in its symbolic meaning, it becomes the visible manifestation of the idea of moral uprightness. Yet, although these two modes of instruction exist within Freemasonry, by legends and by symbols, there is fundamentally no radical disparity between the two methods. The symbol is a visible, and the legend an audible, representation of some contrasted idea, of some moral conception born of a comparison. Both the legend and the symbol pertain to dogmas of a profoundly religious character. Both convey moral sentiments through the same distinctive method, and both of them are designed by this means to illustrate the philosophy of speculative Masonry, to investigate the recondite meaning of these legends and symbols, and to elicit from them the moral and philosophical lessons they were intended to impart, is to draw aside the veil with which ignorance and indifference seek to obscure the true philosophy of Freemasonry. To study the symbolism of Masonry constitutes the sole avenue by which to investigate its philosophy. This represents the portal of its temple, through which alone we may gain access to the cecellum where its secret teachings are concealed. Its philosophy is engaged in the contemplation of propositions relating to God and mankind, to the present existence and the life to come. Its science is the symbolism by which these propositions are presented to the intellect. The work presently offered to the public represents an endeavor to develop and elucidate this philosophy and science. It shall demonstrate that there exist within Freemasonry the germs of profound philosophical speculation. If it fails to engage the learned, it may nevertheless instruct the uninformed. Should this be the case, I shall not regret the labor and research bestowed upon its composition. Albert G. Mackey, Doctor of Medicine, Charleston, South Carolina, February 22, 1869. Chapter 1. Masonic Philosophy Origins. The Origin and Progress of Freemasonry. Any inquiry into the symbolism and philosophy of Freemasonry must necessarily be preceded by a brief investigation into the origin and history of the institution. Ancient and universal as it is, whence did it arise? What were the contingencies associated with its birth? From what kindred or analogous association did it spring? Or was it entirely original and autochthonous, independent in its inception of any external influences, and unassociated with any other institution? These are inquiries that an intelligent investigator will be inclined to propound at the very commencement of his study, and they are questions that must be distinctly answered before he can be expected to comprehend the true character of Freemasonry as a symbolic institution. He must possess some knowledge of its antecedents before he can fully appreciate its character. However, he who expects to arrive at a satisfactory resolution to this inquiry must first, as a preliminary measure absolutely essential to success, emancipate himself from the influence of a misconception into which novices in Masonic philosophy are exceedingly prone to fall. He must not conflate the doctrine of Freemasonry with its outward and extrinsic form. He must not surmise that certain usages and ceremonies, which exist to this day, but which even now remain subject to extensive variations across different nations, constitute the sum and substance of Freemasonry. Prudent antiquity, as Lord Coke observes, did for greater solemnity, and for the better memory and observation of that which is to be performed, express substances through ceremonies. But it must always be remembered, nonetheless, that the ceremony is not the substance itself. It is merely the outer garment that covers and perhaps adorns it, much as clothing does the human figure. Yet, Divest man of that outward apparel, and you still retain the microcosm, the wondrous creation, with all his nerves and bones and muscles and, above all, with his brain and thoughts and sentiments. Similarly, strip masonry of these external ceremonies, and you still have its philosophy and science remaining intact. These have, of course, perpetually remained unchanged, whereas the ceremonies have fluctuated throughout different epochs and continue to vary across distinct countries. The definition of Freemasonry, that it is a science of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols, has been so frequently quoted that, were it not for its inherent beauty, it would have grown wearisome. Nevertheless, this definition encapsulates the precise principle that has just been enunciated. Freemasonry is a science, a philosophy, a system of doctrines imparted, in a manner entirely peculiar to itself, through allegories and symbols. This constitutes its internal character. Its ceremonies are mere external additions, which do not affect its fundamental substance. Therefore, when we prepare to institute an inquiry into the origin of Freemasonry, it is this specific system of philosophy that we must examine, and not the ceremonies that have been appended to it. Should we pursue any alternative course, we shall assuredly fall into error. Thus, if we seek the inception and earliest beginning of Masonic philosophy, we must journey back into the ages of remote antiquity, wherein we shall find this genesis within the bosom of kindred associations, where the identical philosophy was maintained and imparted. But if we conflate the ceremonies of Masonry with the philosophy of Masonry, and seek the origin of the institution molded into the outward form it assumes today, we are scarcely required to look further back than the dawn of the 18th century, and, indeed, perhaps not even quite that far. For numerous significant modifications have been introduced to its rituals since that period. Having arrived at the conclusion, then, that it is not the Masonic ritual but rather the Masonic philosophy whose origin we are to investigate, the ensuing question naturally pertains to the specific nature of that philosophy. Now, therefore, I contend that the philosophy of Freemasonry is engaged in the contemplation of the divine and human character, of God as a singular, eternal, self-existent being, in stark contradiction to the mythology of ancient peoples, which was burdened with a multitude of gods and goddesses, of demigods and heroes, and of man as an immortal entity, preparing in the present life for an eternal future, in similar contradiction to ancient philosophy, which circumscribed human existence entirely to the mortal coil. These two doctrines, then, of the unity of God and the immortality of the soul, constitute the fundamental philosophy of Freemasonry. When we wish to define it succinctly, we declare that it is an ancient system of philosophy which imparts these two central dogmas. And hence, if, amid the intellectual obscurity and debasement of the ancient polytheistic religions, we find interspersed here and there, throughout all ages, certain institutions or associations which taught these truths, and did so in a particular manner, allegorically and symbolically, then we possess the right to assert that such institutions or associations were the incunabula, the predecessors, of the Masonic institution as it exists today. With these preliminary remarks, the reader will be equipped to undertake the consideration of that theory regarding the origin of Freemasonry which I advance in the following propositions. In the first instance, I contend that during the most primordial ages of the world, there existed certain truths of profound importance to the welfare and happiness of humanity, which had been communicated by whatever means, but, most probably, by direct inspiration from God to man. These truths consisted principally of the abstract propositions concerning the unity of God and the immortality of the soul. Regarding the veracity of these two propositions, there can be no reasonable doubt. The belief in these truths is a necessary consequence of that religious sentiment which has perpetually formed an essential feature of human nature. Man is, emphatically, and in distinct contrast to all other creatures, an inherently religious being. Gross commences his compelling work on the heathen religion in its popular and symbolical development by the statement that one of the most remarkable phenomena of the human race is the universal existence of religious ideas, a belief in something supernatural and divine, and a worship corresponding to it. As nature had implanted this religious sentiment, that same nature must have directed it toward a proper channel. The belief and the worship must initially have been as pure as the fountain from whence they flowed, although, in subsequent eras, and prior to the advent of Christian light, they may well have been corrupted by the influence of priests and poets over an ignorant and superstitious populace. The first and second propositions of my theory refer solely to that primeval epoch which was antecedent to these corruptions, of which I shall speak hereafter. These truths regarding God and immortality were most likely handed down through the patriarchal lineage of the race of Seth, but were, at all events, known to Noah, and were subsequently communicated by him to his immediate descendants. In consequence of this communication, the true worship of God continued, for some time after the subsidence of the deluge, to be cultivated by the Noachidae, the Noachites, or the descendants of Noah. At a subsequent period, there was a secession of a vast portion of the human race from the Noachites. These seceders rapidly lost sight of the divine truths which had been imparted to them from their common ancestor, and fell into the most grievous theological errors, corrupting the purity of the worship and the orthodoxy of the religious faith which they had primarily received. These truths were preserved in their absolute integrity by only a select few within the patriarchal line, while still fewer were enabled to retain merely dim and glimmering fragments of the true light. The former class was confined to the direct descendants of Noah, and the latter was to be found among the priests and philosophers, and, perhaps at a still later date, among the poets of the heathen nations, and among those whom they initiated into the secrets of these truths. Regarding the prevalence of these religious truths among the patriarchal descendants of Noah, we possess ample evidence within the sacred records. As to their existence among a body of learned heathens, we rely upon the testimony of numerous erudite writers who have devoted their energies to this subject. Thus the distinguished Grote, in his History of Greece, asserts, the allegorical interpretation of the myths has been, by several learned investigators, especially by Kreutzer, connected with the hypothesis of an ancient and highly instructed body of priests, having their origin either in Egypt or in the East, and communicating to the rude and barbarous Greeks religious, physical, and historical knowledge, under the veil of symbols. What is stated here exclusively regarding the Greeks is equally applicable to every other intellectual nation of antiquity. The system or doctrine of the former class has been designated by Masonic writers as the pure or primitive Freemasonry of antiquity, and that of the latter class as the spurious Freemasonry of the same epoch. These terms were first employed, if I am not mistaken, by Dr. Oliver and are intended to refer, the word pure to the doctrines taught by the descendants of Noah in the Jewish line and the word spurious to his descendants in the heathen or Gentile line. The masses of the populace, particularly among the Gentiles, were entirely unacquainted with this divine truth, which served as the foundation stone of both species of Freemasonry, the pure and the spurious, and were deeply immersed in the errors and falsities of heathen belief and worship. These errors of the heathen religions were not the voluntary inventions of the peoples who cultivated them, but were gradual and almost unavoidable corruptions of the truths which had initially been taught by Noah. And, indeed, so palpable are these corruptions that they can be readily detected and traced back to the original form from which, however much they might vary among different peoples, they had, at one time or another, deviated. Thus, in the life and achievements of Bacchus or Dionysus, we find the travestied counterpart of the career of Moses, and in the name of Vulcan, the blacksmith god, we evidently perceive an etymological corruption of the appellation of Tubal-Cain, the first artificer in metals. For Vulcan is merely a modified iteration of Baal-Cain, the god Cain. However, those among the multitudes, for indeed there were a select few, who were made acquainted with the truth obtained their knowledge by means of initiation into certain sacred mysteries, within whose bosom it remained concealed from the public gaze. These mysteries existed throughout every realm of antiquity, bearing a distinct appellation and, to some degree, a variant form in each. Yet they operated invariably and ubiquitously with the singular design of inculcating, through allegorical and symbolic instruction, the great Masonic doctrines regarding the unity of God and the immortality of the soul. This constitutes a pivotal proposition, and the fact it enunciates must never be obscured during any inquiry into the genesis of Freemasonry. Indeed, the pagan mysteries were to the spurious Freemasonry of antiquity precisely what the Masters' Lodges are to the Freemasonry of the present era. It is superfluous to offer proof of their existence, as this is universally conceded and continually referenced by historians both ancient and modern. Moreover, to discuss their character and organization in minute detail would necessitate an entirely distinct treatise. The Baron de Saint Croix has authored 2 voluminous tomes upon the subject, yet even he left it unexhausted. These 2 divisions of the Masonic institution, as defined in the 9th proposition, namely, the pure or primitive Freemasonry maintained by the Jewish progeny of the Patriarchs, who are termed, by way of distinction, the Noachites or descendants of Noah, because they had neither forgotten nor forsaken the teachings of their illustrious ancestor, and the spurious Freemasonry practiced among the pagan nations, flowed down the stream of time in parallel currents, frequently proximate, yet never commingling. However, these twin currents were not perpetually destined to remain apart. Having sprung in remote antiquity from a single common fountain, that ancient priesthood of whom I have previously spoken in the 8th proposition, and having subsequently bifurcated into the pure and spurious Freemasonry of antiquity to remain segregated for innumerable centuries, they ultimately converged at the construction of the great Temple of Jerusalem. There, they were united through the collaboration of the Israelites under King Solomon, and the Tyrians under Hiram, king of Tyre, alongside Hiram Abiff. The spurious Freemasonry, it is true, did not instantly cease to exist at that juncture. On the contrary, it endured for centuries subsequent to this period. Indeed, it was not until much later, during the reign of the Emperor Theodosius, that the pagan mysteries were finally and utterly abolished. Nevertheless, through the unification of the Jewish or pure Freemasons and the Tyrian or spurious Freemasons at Jerusalem, there occurred a mutual infusion of their respective doctrines and ceremonies. This confluence eventually culminated in the dissolution of the 2 distinctive systems and the establishment of a novel one, which may be regarded as the immediate prototype of the present institution. Consequently, many Masonic scholars, extending their investigations no further into antiquity than the facts delineated in this 15th proposition, are content to identify the origin of Freemasonry at the Temple of Solomon. Yet, if my hypothesis is correct, the truth remains that it received therein not its birth, but merely a new modification of its character. The legend of the 3rd degree, The golden legend, the Legenda Aurea, of Masonry was adopted there by pure Freemasonry, which had previously possessed no such legend, from its spurious counterpart. However, this legend had already existed under alternate appellations and forms across all the mysteries for ages prior. The doctrine of immortality, which had hitherto been imparted by the Nochites simply as an abstract proposition, was thenceforth to be inculcated through a symbolic lesson. The symbol of Hiram the Builder was to become forevermore the distinguishing feature of Freemasonry. Furthermore, another significant modification was effected within the Masonic system during the construction of the temple. Prior to the unification that then occurred, the pure Freemasonry of the Nochites had invariably been speculative, resembling the present organization in no other respect than its cultivation of the same abstract principles of divine truth. The Tyrians, conversely, were architects by profession, and because their leaders were disciples of the school of spurious Freemasonry, they, for the first time at the Temple of Solomon, upon uniting with their Jewish contemporaries, infused the elements of an operative art into the speculative science practiced by the latter. Therefore, the system continued thenceforward for ages to exhibit the commingled elements of operative and speculative masonry. We observe this in the Collegia Fabrorum, or colleges of artificers, initially established in Rome by Numa, which were assuredly Masonic in their organizational form. In the Jewish sect of the Essenes, who labored as ardently as they prayed and who are reputed to be the descendants of the temple builders. And also, even more prominently, in the traveling Freemasons of the Middle Ages, who identify themselves by their very name with their modern successors, and whose societies were composed both of learned men who thought and wrote, and of artisans who labored and built. Thus, for an extended duration, Freemasonry remained simultaneously operative and speculative. Yet, another transformation was required to render the institution precisely what it is today. Consequently, during a relatively recent epoch, the operative feature was relinquished and Freemasonry became exclusively speculative. The exact timing of this evolution is not left to mere conjecture. It transpired during the reign of Queen Anne of England, at the dawn of the 18th century. Preston provides the precise wording of the decree that established this alteration, noting that it was then resolved that the privileges of Masonry should no longer be restricted to operative Masons, but rather extended to men of diverse professions, provided they were duly approved and initiated into the order. The 19 propositions herein articulated offer a brief yet succinct overview of the progression of Freemasonry, from its origin in the primordial ages of the world simply as a system of religious philosophy, through all the modifications to which it was subjected among the Jewish and Gentile races, until it ultimately developed into its present perfected form. Throughout this entire expanse of time, it invariably preserved certain features that may thus be regarded as its specific characteristics. By these, it has always been distinguished from every contemporaneous association, however closely such entities may have simulated its outward form. These characteristics are, firstly, the doctrines it has consistently promulgated, namely, those of the unity of God and the immortality of the soul. And, secondly, the methodology by which these doctrines have been imparted, namely, through symbols and allegories. Taking these characteristics as the defining exponents of what Freemasonry truly is, one cannot avoid the conclusion that the speculative Masonry of the present day exhibits abundant evidence of its shared origin with the spurious Freemasonry of the ante-Solomonic era, both systems emerging from the identical pure source. Yet while one perpetually preserved the purity of that common fountain, the other continually corrupted it. This stands as the necessary conclusion and a natural corollary to the propositions advanced within this essay. Furthermore, there exists abundant historical evidence, of which these propositions form but a meager outline, that a manifest influence was exerted upon the pure or primitive Freemasonry of the Noachites by the Tyrian branch of the Spurious system. This influence is evident in the symbols, myths, and legends that the former inherited from the latter, albeit subsequently modifying and interpreting them to ensure consistency with its own religious framework. One fact, at the very least, remains incapable of refutation, namely that we are indebted to the Tyrian Masons for the introduction of the symbol of Hiram Abiff. The fundamental concept of the symbol, although later modified by the Jewish Masons, is decidedly not Jewish in its inception. It was evidently appropriated from the pagan mysteries, wherein Bacchus, Adonis, Proserpine, and a multitude of other apotheosized beings fulfill the same role that Hiram occupies within the Masonic mysteries. Ultimately, we discover within the technical terminology of Masonry, in its working tools, in the nomenclature of its grades, and in a vast majority of its symbols, abundant testimony to the profound infusion of the elements of an operative art into its religious philosophy. History further elucidates this circumstance by referencing the institution's association with the Dionysiac fraternity of artificers, who were engaged in the construction of Solomon's Temple, with the workmen's colleges of Numa, and with the traveling Freemasons of the Middle Ages, who erected all the magnificent edifices of that era. These 19 propositions, submitted in the present essay, constitute a concise summary or outline of a theory regarding the true origin of Freemasonry, a theory that long and patient investigation has compelled me to adopt. To undertake the verification of each of these propositions sequentially, whether through logical demonstration or historical evidence, would necessitate the composition of an exhaustive treatise. They are presently offered simply as suggestions upon which the Masonic student may reflect. They are intended solely as guideposts to direct him upon his journey, should he embark upon the rewarding albeit arduous task of inquiring into the genesis and evolution of Freemasonry, from its infancy to its present state of mature development. Yet, even in this abridged format, they remain strictly indispensable as a preliminary foundation for any genuine comprehension of Masonic symbolism. Chapter 2. Patriarchal Traditions. I shall proceed, therefore, to investigate the historical origin of Freemasonry, serving as a necessary preamble to any examination of the character of its symbolism. To accomplish this with any expectation of rendering justice to the subject, it is evident that I must establish my point of departure in a profoundly remote antiquity. I shall, however, review the early and antecedent history of the institution with as much brevity as a clear comprehension of the subject will permit, omitting the entirety of the world's antediluvian history, as something that exerted, insofar as our subject is concerned, no influence upon the new world that emerged from the ruins of the old. We discover, shortly after the cataclysm, the immediate descendants of Noah in possession of at least 2 religious truths, which they received from their common father, and which he must necessarily have derived from the lineage of patriarchs who preceded him. These truths comprise the doctrine of the existence of a supreme intelligence, the creator, preserver, and ruler of the universe, and, as a necessary corollary, the belief in the immortality of the soul, which, being an emanation from that primal cause, was to be distinguished through a future and eternal life from the base and perishable dust that constitutes its earthly tabernacle. The assertion that these doctrines were known to and acknowledged by Noah will not appear as a mere assumption to the adherent of divine revelation. However, any philosophical mind must, I contend, arrive at the same conclusion independently of any authority other than that of reason. The religious sentiment, at least insofar as it pertains to the belief in the existence of God, appears to be, in some sense, innate or instinctive and consequently universal within the human mind. There exists no record of any nation, however intellectually and morally debased, that has not exhibited some evidence of a predilection toward such a belief. The sentiment may be perverted, and the idea grossly corrupted, yet it remains undeniably present, betraying the source from which it sprang. Even within the most degraded forms of fetishism, wherein the Negro kneels in reverential awe before the shrine of some crude and misshapen idol, which his own hands, perhaps, have fashioned, the act of adoration, however debased the object may be, is nevertheless an acknowledgment of the worshipper's profound yearning to cast himself upon the support of an unknown power superior to his own sphere. And this unknown power, whatever it may be, constitutes for him a god. Equally universal, however, has been the belief in the immortality of the soul. This arises from man's identical yearning for the infinite, and although, much like the preceding doctrine, it has suffered perversion and corruption, there persists among all nations a tendency toward its acknowledgement. Every populace, from the most remote epochs, has involuntarily drifted toward the ideal of another world, seeking to secure a resting place for their departed spirits. The deification of the dead, whether manifested as man-worship or hero-worship, constituted the subsequent evolution of the religious idea following fetishism, serving simply as an acknowledgement of the belief in a future life. For the dead could not have been deified had they not continued to live after death. The adoration of a putrefying carcass would have represented a form of fetishism more base and degrading than any yet discovered. Yet, man-worship succeeded fetishism. It represented a higher development of the religious sentiment, encompassing a possible hope for, if not a definitive belief in, a future existence. Reason, therefore, as well as revelation, leads us irresistibly to the conclusion that these two doctrines prevailed among the descendants of Noah immediately following the deluge. Furthermore, they were embraced in all their pristine purity and integrity, having been derived from the highest and purest source. These are the doctrines that continue to constitute the creed of Freemasonry. Hence, one of the appellations bestowed upon Freemasons from the earliest epochs was that of the Noachidae or Noachites, which is to say, the descendants of Noah and the transmitters of his religious dogmas. Chapter 3. Primitive Masonry. The subsequent historical epoch of significance demanding our attention is that associated with what sacred history terms the dispersion at Babel. The radiance of truth, as originally communicated by Noah, became obscured, as it were, by a dense cloud. The dogmas regarding the unity of God and the immortality of the soul were gradually eclipsed, and the initial deviation from true worship materialized in the establishment of Sabianism, the veneration of the sun, moon, and stars among certain peoples, alongside the deification of men among others. Of these two deviations, Sabianism or sun worship was both the earlier and the more broadly diffused. It appears, as the learned Owen observes, to have originated from fragmented traditions, conveyed by the patriarchs, concerning the dominion of the sun by day and the moon by night. The manner in which this ancient system has been modified and spiritually symbolized by Freemasonry shall form the subject of future consideration. Yet Sabianism, while constituting the most ancient of religious corruptions, was also, as previously noted, the most universally diffused. Consequently, even among those nations that later adopted the polytheistic creed of deified men and factitious gods, this primordial sun worship is observed to be continually exerting its influence. Thus, among the Greeks, the most refined civilization to cultivate hero worship, Hercules represented the sun. The mythological fable of his destroying the many-headed Hydra of the Lernaean marshes with his arrows was merely an allegory, signifying the dissipation of pollutal malaria by the purifying rays of the diurnal orb. Similarly, among the Egyptians, the principal deity, Osiris, served merely as another appellation for the sun, while his archenemy and destroyer, Typhon, stood as the personification of night or darkness. Finally, among the Hindus, the three manifestations of their supreme deity, Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu, functioned as symbols representing the rising, meridian, and setting sun. This early and widespread prevalence of solar veneration merits particular attention due to the profound influence it exerted upon the spurious Freemasonry of antiquity, a subject I shall address shortly, an influence that remains palpable, albeit modified and Christianized, within our modern system. Indeed, the vast majority of contemporary Masonic symbols can only be comprehensively understood and properly appreciated through reference to this ancient solar worship. Consequently, the divine truth regarding the existence of one supreme God, the grand architect of the universe, symbolized in Freemasonry as the true word, was lost to the Sabians and the polytheists who emerged following the dispersion at Babel. Along with it, the doctrine of a future life also vanished. Therefore, in a specific portion of the Masonic ritual, alluding to this historical event, we speak of the lofty Tower of Babel, where language was confounded and Masonry was lost. Nevertheless, certain builders upon the plain of Shinar preserved these profound religious and Masonic doctrines concerning the unity of God and the immortality of the soul in their pristine purity. These individuals were the patriarchs, within whose venerable lineage such tenets continued to be imparted. Thus, years after the dispersion of the nations at Babel, the world presented two great religious traditions, flowing onward down the stream of time, parallel yet as fundamentally divergent as light from darkness, and truth from falsehood. One of these lineages of religious thought and sentiment comprised the idolatrous and pagan world. Within it, all Masonic doctrine, at least in its pure form, became extinct, although it was interspersed with and occasionally influenced by an offshoot from the other lineage to which attention shall soon be directed. The second of these lineages consisted, as previously stated, of the patriarchs and priests who preserved, in absolute purity, the two great Masonic doctrines, the unity of God and the immortality of the soul. This lineage thus encompassed what, in the parlance of contemporary Masonic writers, has been designated as the primitive Freemasonry of antiquity. Now, it is by no means intended here to advance the gratuitous and untenable theory, proposed by certain imaginative writers, that the Freemasonry of the patriarchs resembled the presently existing system in its organization, ritual, or symbolism. Indeed, it is uncertain whether it possessed a ritual or even a symbolism at all. It is highly probable that it was composed primarily of abstract propositions derived from antediluvian traditions. Dr. Oliver considers it probable that a few symbols existed among these primitive and pure Freemasons, enumerating among them the serpent, the triangle, and the point within a circle. However, I can find no authoritative basis for this supposition, nor do I consider it just to claim for the order more than that to which it is rightfully entitled, or more than it can be demonstrably proven to possess. When Anderson designates Moses as a Grand Master, Joshua as his deputy, and Aholiab and Bezaleel as Grand Wardens, the expression must be regarded simply as a figure of speech, a mode of expression entirely figurative in character, and by no means intended to convey the concepts currently associated with such officers in the modern system. It would, undoubtedly, have been preferable had such language been avoided. The sole claim that can be legitimately made regarding the system of primitive Freemasonry, as practiced by the patriarchs, is that it embraced and imparted the two great dogmas of the institution, namely the unity of God and the immortality of the soul. It is possible, and indeed highly probable, that a secret doctrine existed, and that this teaching was not indiscriminately communicated. It is established that Moses, who was necessarily the recipient of the knowledge of his predecessors, did not publicly teach the doctrine of the soul's immortality. There was, however, an oral or secret law among the Jews that was never committed to writing until after the captivity. It is reasonable to surmise that this law may have contained the recognition of those dogmas of primitive Freemasonry. Briefly, then, this system of primitive Freemasonry, devoid of any ritual or symbolism that has descended to us, consisting solely of traditional legends, teaching only the two great truths previously mentioned, and remaining entirely speculative in character without the slightest infusion of an operative element, was regularly transmitted through the Jewish lineage of patriarchs, priests, and kings. It endured without alteration, augmentation, or diminution until the era of Solomon and the construction of the Temple at Jerusalem. Leaving this pure tradition to pursue its steady course of descent, let us refer once more to that alternative lineage of religious history, the one coursing through the idolatrous and polytheistic nations of antiquity, to trace the steady rise and progress of another division of the Masonic institution, which, by way of distinction, has been termed the Spurious Freemasonry of antiquity. Chapter 4. Spurious Pagan Mysteries. Within the vast yet barren desert of polytheism, as dark and dreary as its gloomy domains may have been, there were still to be found a few isolated oases of truth. The philosophers and sages of antiquity, in the course of their erudite researches and guided by the light of nature, had discovered a measure of those inestimable truths regarding God and a future state. These were the very truths that their patriarchal contemporaries had received as a revelation bestowed upon their common ancestry prior to the deluge, and which had been retained and promulgated by Noah following that cataclysm. Possessing these dim yet purifying perceptions, they were unwilling to degrade the majesty of the first great cause by dividing his attributes among a Zeus and a Hera in Greece, a Jupiter and a Juno in Rome, or an Osiris and an Isis in Egypt. Furthermore, they could not believe that the thinking, feeling, and reasoning soul, the guest and companion of the body, would, at the hour of corporeal dissolution, be consigned alongside it to total annihilation. Consequently, in the earliest epochs following the era of the dispersion, there were certain individuals among the heathens who maintained a belief in the unity of God and the immortality of the soul. However, they dared not promulgate these doctrines publicly. The minds of the populace, groveling in superstition and devoted, as St. Paul testifies of the Athenians, to the worship of unknown gods, were ill-prepared for the philosophical teachings of a pure theology. It was, indeed, an axiom unhesitatingly enunciated and frequently reiterated by their writers that there exist many truths with which it is useless to acquaint the masses, and many fables that it is inexpedient for them to recognize as false. Such is the position of Varro, as preserved by St. Augustine. Similarly, Strabo, another of their writers, asserts that it is impossible for a philosopher to guide a multitude of women and ignorant individuals through rational discourse, thereby inviting them to piety, holiness, and faith. Rather, the philosopher must also employ superstition, neglecting neither the invention of fables nor the performance of wonders. Therefore, while in those early ages of the world we find the masses languishing in the intellectual debasement of polytheistic and idolatrous religions, possessing no support for the present and no hope for the future, living without the knowledge of a supreme, superintending providence, and dying without the expectation of a blissful immortality, we simultaneously discover ample testimony that these consoling doctrines were secretly harbored by the philosophers and their disciples. Yet, despite being believed, these doctrines were never publicly taught. They constituted heresies that would have been impolitic and perilous to introduce to the public ear. They were truths that might have incited contempt for the established system and precipitated the overthrow of popular superstition. Socrates, the Athenian sage, serves as an illustrious exemplar of the severe retribution meted out to the audacious innovator who attempted to insult the gods and to poison the minds of youth with the heresies of a philosophic religion. They permitted, therefore, notes a learned writer on this subject, the multitude to remain plunged as they were in the depths of a gross and complicated idolatry. But for that philosophic few who could endure the light of truth without being confounded by its blaze, they removed the mysterious veil, and displayed to them the deity in the radiant glory of his unity. From the vulgar eye, however, these doctrines were kept inviolably sacred, and wrapped within a veil of impenetrable mystery. The consequence of all this was, that no one was permitted to be invested with the knowledge of these sublime truths, until by a course of severe and arduous trials, by a long and painful initiation, and by a formal series of gradual preparations, he had proved himself worthy and capable of receiving the full illumination of wisdom. For this purpose, therefore, those peculiar religious institutions were organized which the ancients designated as the mysteries, and which, owing to the resemblance of their organization, their objects, and their doctrines, have by Masonic writers been called the spurious Freemasonry of antiquity. Warburton, in providing a definition of what these mysteries were, states, "Each of the pagan gods had a secret worship paid unto him, to which none were admitted but those who had been selected by preparatory ceremonies, called initiation. This secret worship was termed the mysteries." I shall now endeavor briefly to trace the connection between these mysteries and the institution of Freemasonry, and to do so, it will be necessary to enter upon certain details regarding the constitution of those mystic assemblies. Almost every nation of the ancient world possessed its peculiar mysteries, dedicated to the occult worship of some especial and favored deity, and to the inculcation of a secret doctrine, profoundly different from that which was imparted in the public ceremonials of devotion. Thus in Persia the mysteries were dedicated to Mithras or the sun, in Egypt to Isis and Osiris, in Greece to Demeter, in Samothracia to the gods Cabiri, the mighty ones, in Syria to Dionysus, while in the more northern nations of Europe, such as Gaul and Britain, the initiations were dedicated to their indigenous deities, and were celebrated under the general designation of the Druidical rites. But no matter where or how instituted, whether ostensibly in honor of the effeminate Adonis, the favorite of Venus, or of the implacable Odin, the Scandinavian god of war and carnage, whether dedicated to Demeter, the embodiment of the earth, or to Mithras, the symbol of all that fructifies that earth, the great object and design of the secret instruction were identical in all places, and the mysteries constituted a school of religion wherein the errors and absurdities of polytheism were revealed to the initiated. The candidate was taught that the multitudinous deities of the popular theology were but hidden symbols of the various attributes of the supreme God, a spirit invisible and indivisible, and that the soul, as an emanation from his essence, could never see corruption, but must, after the death of the body, be raised unto an eternal life. That this was the doctrine and the object of the mysteries is evident from the concurrent testimony both of those ancient writers who flourished contemporaneously with their practice, and of those modern scholars who have devoted themselves to their investigation. Thus Isocrates, speaking of them in his panegyric, says, "Those who have been initiated in the mysteries of Ceres entertain better hopes both as to the end of life and the entirety of futurity." Epictetus declares that everything in these mysteries was instituted by the ancients for the instruction and moral amendment of life. And Plato asserts that the design of initiation was to restore the soul to that pristine state of perfection from which it had originally fallen. Thomas Taylor, the celebrated Platonist, who possessed an extraordinary acquaintance with the character of these ancient rites, asserts that they obscurely intimated, by mystic and splendid visions, the felicity of the soul, both here and hereafter, when purified from the defilements of a material nature and constantly elevated to the realities of intellectual vision. Kreutzer, a distinguished German writer, who has examined the subject of the ancient mysteries with profound judgment and elaboration, offers a theory on their nature and design which is eminently worthy of consideration. This theory posits that when there had been placed under the eyes of the initiated symbolical representations of the creation of the universe, and the origin of things, the migrations and purifications of the soul, the beginning and progression of civilization and agriculture, there was drawn from these symbols and these scenes in the mysteries an instruction destined exclusively for the more perfect, or the epops, unto whom were communicated the doctrines of the existence of a single and eternal God, and the ultimate destination of the universe and of man. Kreutzer here, however, refers rather to the general object of the instructions than to the character of the rites and ceremonies by which they were impressed upon the mind. For in the mysteries, much as in Freemasonry, the Hierophant, whom we would presently call the master of the lodge, often, as Lobeck observes, delivered a mystical lecture or discourse on some moral subject. Faber, who, notwithstanding the predominance in his mind of a theory which referred every rite and symbol of the ancient world to the traditions of Noah, the Ark, and the Deluge, has provided a generally accurate view of the systems of ancient religion, describes the initiation into the mysteries as a scenic representation of the mythic descent into Hades, or the grave, and the return from thence to the light of day. In a few words, then, the object of instruction in all these mysteries was the unity of God, and the intention of the ceremonies of initiation into them was, by a scenic representation of death, and subsequent restoration to life, to impress the profound truths of the resurrection of the dead and the immortality of the soul. I need scarcely here advert to the remarkable similarity in design and conformation which existed between these ancient rites and the third or master's degree of Masonry. Like it, they were all funereal in their character. They commenced in sorrow and lamentation, they concluded in joy. There was an aphonism or burial, apostase or grave, an euresis or discovery of what had been lost, and a legend or mythical relation, all of which were entirely and profoundly symbolical in their character. And hence, observing this striking identity of design and form between the initiations of the ancients and those of modern Masons, writers have been disposed to designate these mysteries as the spurious Freemasonry of antiquity. Chapter 5. Ancient Rites Compared. I now propose, for the purpose of illustrating these views, and of familiarizing the reader with the coincidences between Freemasonry and the ancient mysteries, so that he may be better enabled to appreciate the mutual influences of each on the other as they are hereafter to be developed, to present a more detailed relation of one or more of these ancient systems of initiation. As our initial illustration, let us select the mysteries of Osiris, as they were practiced in Egypt, the birthplace of all that is wondrous in the arts or sciences, or mysterious in the religion of the ancient world. It was upon the lake of Sais that the solemn ceremonies of the Osirian initiation were performed. On this lake, says Herodotus, it is that the Egyptians represent by night his sufferings whose name I refrain from mentioning, and this representation they call their mysteries. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.